Welcome. I'm glad you're here because we have a lot of work to do on a very important issue, and we have a tremendous opportunity to make things better. It is the honor and the responsibility of any society to help young people. And that help comes from knowledge and understanding, foremost. We are so fortunate to have this panel here with us to help guide that effort towards that knowledge and understanding. So much to talk about. Let's dive right in. Ian Alexander is an actor and activist. He starred in The OA on Netflix. Ian is a transgender person, uses masculine pronouns. Ian, you're a successful actor. What made you decide to be a mental health advocate as well?
Thank you, John. I decided to be a mental health advocate, honestly, just out of want for transparency and visibility. I was very transparent about everything else going on in my life, like being trans, being queer. And there's just such little trans masculine representation in the media. And I know that trans people face disproportionately higher rates of mental illness, houselessness, suicide, sexual abuse, and etc. So I know that there are a lot of folks like me who are going through this and they don't want to be alone. And so I just wanted to be sort of not like a figure, but just someone else that is visible that people can look up to. And I know that my experience is unique from everyone else's. Every trans person, every person in general has a different story. But I just hope that I can bring to the table my experience with depression, anxiety, and mental illness, and just help normalize it. Realize that this isn't something that makes people bad people. We're all trying our best, especially during this time. Um, so, yeah, thank you for asking, John.
How is the healthcare system prepared for young people, for trans people, for people of color, young people who might be outside of the mainstream? What has been your experience in how well situated the whole system is?
I'm glad that you asked because honestly, I would say that the healthcare system is just not adequately prepared to treat transgender people, especially Black and Indigenous transgender people. People who are darker skinned face so much more discrimination in the healthcare industry, whether it's like a general care doctor or psychiatrist, et cetera. Like, I really think that the solution to that is hiring more trans people in the mental health profession, hiring more Black people in the mental health profession, and just having more inclusion, you know, not only in the patients that they're seeing, but in the doctors that are providing care as well. Because I have heard so many experiences of not just like my own experience, but other trans people that I know, um, especially trans people of color who've just faced such discrimination in the healthcare industry based off of their identity, based off of the fact that um, there are, I don't know the exact statistics, so I'm not going to give an exact number, but I do know that generally speaking in the United States, healthcare professionals view Black people as like more pain tolerant because they're like tougher and stronger and they can tolerate more pain. And so they're not taken as seriously when they say, you know, I'm really suffering, I'm in a lot of pain. And that is just unacceptable. It's something that we really need to work on changing just at the root of um, you know, the American foundation of psychiatry, whatever it is, like is getting to the root of that. Um, it just starts with hiring more people behind the scenes, more people that are trans, more people that are LGBT themselves, so that they can provide that care for people like me, who are just trying to get equal access to healthcare and trying to be seen and understood. It's really hard when you're telling a doctor about your identity and your struggles with it, and then they just say, "Oh well, you know, that's normal. It's just a phase. Like you're just a confused teenager." That was my personal experience, and it was really disheartening. It was really invalidating. It made me feel discouraged from seeking out more help, and so I want to prevent that happening. again, to anyone else that I love and care about, because everyone deserves help. Everyone deserves to feel like they're not alone.
Thank you so much, Ian, for being with us today. Alexis Davis is an alumnus of the PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Labs program. She is an activist and member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians in Belport, North Dakota. Alexis, what are the challenges in your particular community that you're working to overcome in terms of mental health?
Hi, John. How are you? Thank you for asking me to be on the panel, first of all. I think most specifically with my reservation, I live on a 6 mile by 12 mile reservation here in North Dakota. And I think the biggest thing we face is because we are so small of a community, it's hard to find those resources. And when we do figure out things, it's really difficult to get them started because of maybe lack of funding, lack of knowledge, anything like of that sort. I feel like when you're an Indigenous person, and just like Ian said, when you're seeking that help, you want someone to like relate to you. So when you're an Indigenous person and you're going through generational trauma and you're trying to figure out your identity, trying to figure out your culture, which has been lost over 500, 600 years, and that's how you feel like you're going to best help yourself. When you have a person like that and you're looking for a person like that, it's really tough. And that, I feel like that's the biggest thing we're facing as a community, is just finding those professionals that can help us help ourselves through our culture, through our identity, through our language. When you have a language that is dying, that is on the verge of dying, and you only have maybe 3 elders who speak it, or you don't know who to go to for these things, it's really difficult. I dealt with that firsthand. I've went through mental health, and I've had depression, and I was given anxiety, and I was given all these things, and it was like, hey, how do you deal with it? You know what I mean? But as an Indigenous person, I knew that the way I was going to help myself was through my tribal ceremonies, my tribal medicines, my language. And I didn't have that growing up in my family. I didn't have that cultural leader close to me. So I had to seek like elsewhere. And I had to look for that person in my community, find trust in them, and move forward that way. That's really complex. And when you're asking a youth to do that, um, it's a lot to ask for, and it's a big task to take on.
I mean, I would think it would be a huge challenge for anyone or any group of people. What gives you hope when you are working on this issue, when you're faced with as huge a task as you are?
What gives me hope is that our youth today are they're so open to things. Especially on my reservation, we have two clashing cultures because of what happened in the past. We mixed with French, and our elders have a battle going on. You're either French and Christian, or you're traditional and culture. Like, there's a big split. And you ask our youth, like, what side are you on? Again, you have to figure out what your identity is again. But our youth are so inspirational, and they want to know their culture, they want to know their language, they want to go to ceremonies. This is how they want to help themselves and help end generational trauma, because that's up to us as a generation, is to try ending that and trying to help ourselves. Because there's a mentality that we have, is we have to think 7 generations ahead. So when you think 7 generations ahead, you have to help yourself in order to help them. You need to help your land in order so they could live off of it. You need to take care of yourself so you could take care of your people. And it's just kind of a ripple effect. So the fact that our youth are so involved, they want to create programs, they want it in the school systems, they want it in the court systems, they want it in their everyday lives, and they're taking those steps for it to happen, is really inspiring. And I really do feel like there's going to be a positive change around my reservation and around Indigenous people as a whole.
Thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for being with us. Dr. Ken Duckworth is medical director for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Ken, how would you describe the situation we're in right now with youth mental health in America today, like overall?
Well, John, America had a vulnerability in mental health prior to the pandemic, for example, and prior to our increased consciousness about racial injustice. 1 in 5 Americans was living with a mental health condition, and the rates of suicide in the young, the rates of overdose overall were increasing. So a few observations. I do think more people have had anxiety. More people are struggling with isolation. I have seen opportunities for empathy. If you're experiencing anxiety, panic, or isolation, you may view a person who lives with a vulnerability a little bit differently. And I also want to say I see the younger generation leading the way on this conversation, as Alexis just discussed. I had to become a psychiatrist to talk about my dad's bipolar disorder. Now, in the modern world, people can just share with each others. Young people experience a lot of mental health vulnerabilities. 3/4 of all mental health problems or conditions begin before age 25. So the fact that the younger generation is able to talk about it, able to seek help, is creatively engaging in this conversation is incredibly hopeful to me.
Okay. And so how has that changed with COVID, with civil unrest, with everything that's been happening lately? Are the young people able to roll with that better because they are more resilient, or has that hit them especially hard?
Well, a lot of people are resilient, and staying connected and having a community that you can talk about the issues of injustice or the issues of mental health in your own experience are really important. I do want to mention that the American mental health field, which has never been accused of being quick acting, is now providing teletherapy at very high levels. And so if you need professional help, while you may not be able to do many of the things that you want to do in life outside your home or living in situation, you're very likely to be able to see a counselor through telehealth. That's a very big change. And because individual circumstances vary a lot, I do like to emphasize the point that mental health services are something that are running at 100%, even during this period of pandemic.
Dr. William H. Carson, MD, is chairman of Dr. William H. Carson, MD, is chairman of the Sozose Foundation. He's a psychiatrist, innovator, and clinical researcher. Dr. Carson, if we're going to make institutional change dealing with mental health issues in our nation, can you speak to decriminalization of mental health and how we can focus on disadvantaged populations?
Thank you very much. And the Sozose Foundation, Sozose is a Japanese word for creativity. And we are looking forward to using that creativity in the types of funds that we put out there for the community. With regards to decriminalization of mental illness, this is one of the key areas that we have great interest in. It is driven in large measure by the idea across the country, somewhat attached to stigma and others attached to just the available resources. In many big counties across the US, you'll have most of them run jails or prisons, and they will say that they have the best mental health care in their community. I think this is incredibly unfortunate because there is no other medical illness where you would think about having your treatment in a prison or a jail. So I think we have to really take this seriously and come back to let's do appropriate diagnosis. One of my key beliefs is that your first diagnosis should not happen in a prison or jail setting. And I think that it is unfortunate that you have that happen. And you know, in the conversation about marginalized communities, Black and Brown gay and trans communities, all of them have numbers approaching 50, 60%. And each segment of those communities has a piece of that segment that ends up in the prison or jail system. And what we need to be able to do is to understand how should you effectively move people from those systems. What's the role of technology? You know, we live in a world where people have devices, we have wearable devices, we have sensors. Are there ways that we can use those types of things to help with making sure that people find a more appropriate place for their treatment, a more appropriate place for them to get well and to get healthy? If I go to the second half of your question about the marginalized communities, we're seeing this, and let's put it in the broader context of COVID. You're seeing Black, Brown, Indigenous communities more impacted by the pandemic. People will largely say it has to do with comorbid health conditions. However, you have to look further in there. The social determinants of health are incredibly impactful with what's happening there. Now, social determinants of health, the key drivers are health inequities, vast disparities in job opportunities, income and inherited family wealth, housing security or lack of housing security, access to quality school, healthy food, green spaces. If we address those particular issues, you would see more equitability across health. And we have to remember that those same social determinants of health have a huge impact when it comes to the mental health of all of our citizens. So I think in this time that we're living in, we need to address it for physical conditions, but we also need to make sure that we don't forget to look at those social determinants of health in the context of mental illness and mental well-being.
You know, when I think about the issue of mental health overall in America, and especially among young people, among people of color, all the factors going on, it's so overwhelming to me to think, well, what can I do about it if I'm some guy? It's a little like, you know, I guess if I recycle, maybe that'll help climate change, but I feel like a very small drop in that bucket. What can ordinary people do to move society in a positive direction on this issue?
I think it is a tough question because the situation is so big and so all-encompassing. So what I would suggest is at a basic grassroots level, people should be very active with regards to the healthcare systems that are available to them, and also making sure that they understand the statistics, the data out of those systems. You know, when a person goes to an emergency room in a county, what's the percentage of the people who are Black and brown and trans and queer and marginalized that end up in the prison system versus in other systems? And once you start asking those questions, you can also be able to say, this is inappropriate, this is unequitable, we need to be better, we need to do better. But if you don't have the data, you'll never be able to demand that changes is made.
So the onus is on us to do our research, to be up on what's happening in our community.
I think the onus is on us to demand that the research, the data is given to us. And we also, what we're noticing in the current COVID crisis, the data itself is not being collected. So we have to be able to say, this is inappropriate. You need to be able to tell us what are happening in our Indigenous communities, what are happening with our trans communities, what are happening across the board in all of our communities. Don't give us a blank number. Let's look at what the reality of the situation are. And once those systems provide that, then we can demand action.
Akilah Hughes is a writer, comedian, YouTuber. She's the host of the Crooked Media daily news podcast, What a Day. Akilah, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Everybody here is amazing. Hey, John.
No, it's an honor to be in the room. Um, are things going to be different in terms of mental health for young people, for people of color, in a world altered by the death of George Floyd?
I think that, we are on a continuum of grief, of being awake, being continuously awoken by these really tragic instances. I will say that, in my own personal life, I think the first time I was deeply affected mentally, physically, just devastated was probably Mike Brown's death, because it was the most social media death that had happened at that point. That's 2015. And I think that every time you see something that horrible and ugly and inhumane and indecent and terrible, it changes you. I don't think that there's a world where you can be unchanged by that unless you don't have a heart. And so, like everyone is saying, there is a lack of resources, a lack of representation in mental health care, a lack of Black therapists. And so, and also America is a diverse country, but it is, in many ways segregated. And so the people that I may work with, and not in this job, because I work somewhere with lots of Black people, which is great. But when I was younger, working in social media agencies, I would have been the only Black person there in a lot of rooms, dealing with the emotional anguish in a lot of ways alone. And so I think that what has changed with this is the fact that because we are all at home because of this pandemic, and we have this idea that we're all in this together, seeing that even when we're all in this together, there are such stark disparities, has woken us up. And so I do think that going forward, I think that for one, Black people have never been as listened to as we have in the past few weeks, which feels wild to say because there's a lot of people still not listening. But I think that, specifically to your question, I think that for young Black people, the internet presents a lot of new challenges for dealing with racism and oppression that, even my grandmother didn't have to deal with. I had this joke with my mom that, my grandmother at least got to go home and get away from the racist people at some point. Like maybe all day long it was terrible and she was living under, Jim Crow in Kentucky. It was a different time. But when she closed her door, it was her house. It wasn't everybody's opinion being thrown at her about, who she was, what she looked like, where she came from, a lot of terrible, disgusting prejudice and, assumptions. It just got to be her house. And with social media, we're never more than, a foot away from the worst thing people want to say about you or the people you come from. And I think that we have only begun to scratch the surface of what that means, how that's changed us, and how to deal with it.
Is it a matter then of getting a deeper, more comprehensive view of how bad things are, how bad things could be before a positive shift can happen? Is a positive shift already happening? There's certainly more awareness than there was, but
Mm-hmm.
has
Yeah.
something turned in a good direction?
I definitely think so. To Dr. Carson's point, there have been lots of data has been released since the horrible killing of George Floyd. Laws have been changed. Confederate monuments have been torn down. Legislation has been proposed and passed in the House, maybe not the Senate. We all know where we're living. But there is momentum, and that momentum is coming from people saying we are no longer going to let this happen and have no one be held accountable. And so I think, there is a change that's coming. What's unfortunate is that it has always had to come at the cost of human life. It's never just, people realizing that all people are people and we should just, respect and give space and appreciate. It always has to come, at this terrible price. And I think that that's what needs to change. But I hope that changes. I do think though that things are, maybe they're not getting better everywhere and they're not getting better really quickly, but we are starting to see a very visceral chipping away of, white supremacy and all of the systems that have upheld it. And I also think that like every single industry is having a reckoning right now, and that only further proves the point, right? That this is not something that happens, one day in Minneapolis. This is something that happens in every industry every day, in small injustices and large ones. And so I think that you can't unlearn that. And I don't think that we're going to go back to pretending it's okay.
Well, Akilah, thanks. Stephanie Bellerose is an attorney, corporate, and philanthropy professional and a mental health advocate. She's co-founder of the Steve Fund, which is a nonprofit organization promoting mental health and emotional well-being of young people of color from teen years through their 20s. The Steve Fund is named for Stephanie's son, Stephen, who died by suicide. And her son, Evan Rose, is board president of that organization. He's with us as well. Stephanie, getting effective mental health treatment in America is difficult. We know this, especially for young people of color. There are obstacles of race, stigma, availability of treatment. Our panelists have touched on this already. How does a young person possibly address all of that?
Thank you, John. That is an excellent question. And you're right that it is a very sizable challenge for young people of color. We as a family experienced that when our own son, who was an African-American male, was seeking help. And we found that there were indeed challenges in accessing individuals who had a cultural affinity to our community and who would be able to work from that strength to connect with the particular needs that he felt. I heard Alexis and Ian and Akilah all mentioning the fact that there is today more visibility, more openness just over the last few years. This has, in fact, I believe, begun to really build momentum for young people of color. But there's still the challenge of the adequacy and accessibility of culturally sensitive care. And that's why the Steve Fund, which you've mentioned, an organization we founded given the gaps, is very dedicated to identifying people from all of the diverse communities of our country who are equipped to provide mental health care and consultation to organizations that need to be involved. One of the very important aspects of our work, and we believe a very critical step for the entire nation to move forward in responding to the needs of young people, and particularly young people of color and other vulnerable groups, is to ensure that we're working across sectors. We cannot have a single community or organization working in a silo. And so we have been very committed to working with partners in the higher education sector, partners in the private sector, partners in the nonprofit sector, and in the health sector, and bringing all of those resources to bear in order to ensure we have the necessary reach to help young people to access the kind of care that they need, and families to access the kind of consultation and encouragement and support and knowledge that they need to be able to really respond to their young people who may be experiencing challenges that they're not familiar with.
And Evan Rose, Evan, in talking to young people of color, what's the biggest mental health challenge right now that you're hearing about?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of, it's almost a perfect storm right now. So we're dealing with the effects of a pandemic. We're dealing with the effects of an economic downturn that's caused a mass of joblessness that's disproportionately affecting people of color. And then we're talking about essentially the unveiling that most of us knew, but most folks didn't want to talk about publicly, of a systematic racism in our country that pervades pretty much every aspect of everyday life. So I think there's a couple of things bundled up inside of that. With a lot of the uncertainty around the economic state, there's a lot of anxiety spiking. There's a lot of issues of even not even knowing what that is. You know, there's folks who are dealing with issues and not even knowing the name of those issues are unable to seek care because they feel like it's just a blanket that everybody else is dealing with. And so one of the great things that's happening is the advances in telehealth, or I should say the advances in the distribution of low cost and free telehealth to a number of different communities, as well as the fact that everybody's talking about it. I think one of the big shifts that we're seeing right now is that people are opening up in forums that they might not have opened up previously in. In my own company, we are having regular weekly talks about how people are feeling, how they're dealing with the sort of economic issues, how they're dealing with the issues of systemic racism, and having those conversations in a space that's generally reserved for the professional. And I know that they're happening at other companies and agencies around the world has been an amazing shift. So I guess to go back to the core question, it's almost a seminal moment for people to realize that there are issues that they didn't even know what the name for, and to be able to put that name on them and to begin to seek support and help from a community of people who are also experiencing an unprecedented experience in our lifetimes, which creates this greater community as a whole to even have this conversation or this forum even.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a little of when, as a society, we said smoking is bad, and there
Right.
started to be a shift in all parts of society. I think we're seeing some of that with mental health now, not always evenly, but certainly there. In your experience in talking to people, what has been effective for people in addressing some of these situations and addressing some of the disparities in the mental health system and just trying to get better?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that we've seen, within the context of our organization, getting better representation amongst mental health professionals, or at the very least, elevating the voices of diverse mental health professionals to enable them to have a bigger platform and to be able to, let folks know that there are different backgrounds and different colors that are available, as far as lived experience to connect with. That's huge. The confluence of telehealth is another big advancement that we're seeing, from the text to audio to video. I think it's almost easier in a lot of ways to access mental health support in that manner because it seems less daunting and like there'll be less stigma, even though the stigma has been reduced year over year over the last several years with additional, technological innovations that we've seen hit the marketplace. So I think that's kind of the some of the ways that it's been talked about, at least in my estimation.
Okay. Well, again, for all of you, such an honor to have you here, and thanks for your insight. We've talked a little bit about telehealth. We've talked about social media. We've talked about kind of the online world that perhaps our grandparents didn't need to worry about quite so much. All right, anybody want to come right out of the gate and talk about the effects of social media on youth mental health? Ian.
I have like kind of dual perspectives just based off of my own personal experience as someone who has dealt with depression and anxiety since I was a really young teenager up until now. So there are kind of two sides to social media. There's the helpful side and then the not very helpful side. I feel like the helpful side, obviously, a sense of community, like people have been talking about how the dialogue about mental health is a lot more open with Gen Z. People are honest and upfront about the symptoms and the feelings that they're experiencing. So there is that sense of community and togetherness and solidarity that social media provides of just being like, hey, like let's talk about this. What's going on in our lives? What are we feeling? And then I feel like there's also the kind of an unhelpful side that can sort of perpetuate this toxic cycle of catastrophizing and overgeneralizing and just falling into really toxic thought patterns. I feel extra anxious when something like a particular event is going on in the world and I see everyone talking about it and it's just kind of day after day, just the one particular topic. It can get overwhelming and overstimulating and it's really hard to find that that balance between a healthy amount of social media and then when it becomes just like hyper vigilant scrolling until 3 in the morning, which is not very healthy.
Scrolling, I think they call it sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I do think that there is a helpful side to social media and definitely a side that can become dangerous and toxic if not utilized properly.
Alexis, what do you think?
On social media, I've seemed to have more of a negative experience as an Indigenous person. You just for an example, mascots. You have the Redskins, you have the Chiefs, you have all these logos that are supposed to represent or that I'm supposed to look like, are what people perceive me to look like. You have sexy Pocahontas, and you see people wearing headdresses, and just things like that, and seeing what people perceive me as, what people perceive what a headdress is. A headdress is the highest honor an Indigenous person, or not even Indigenous person, it would be a Plains tribe, which I am. Those are the highest honors that you can get. And for someone just, wear it around with maybe a bra and bikini, or just to support a team, knowing that my people have died and my people have fought for years to get those, and they're so spiritual to me, just kind of be tossed aside and just be like, well, I'm just supporting a team, or I'm just living my life, stuff like that. And having to see that, and it brings a lot of confusion for youth. We already suffer with our identities, and to see that also coming up daily is tough. And that also brings a lot more of missing and murdered Indigenous women with sexy Pocahontas and all of that. We're more sexualized as women, and um, it's tough. It's tough because I've seen these stats where it was 1 in 3 Indigenous women will be raped in their lifetime. 1 in 5 will be sexually assaulted. And I am part of that stat. I am that stat. And I'm, am I going to be the 1 in 3? Am I going to be the 1 in 5? And eventually, is that going to happen to me? I mean, honestly, it has already happened to me. I have been sexually assaulted. And I look at my fellow Indigenous sisters, and knowing that that's also on their back it's really tough. And social media really pushes that, I feel like, and it does have its ups and downs. I do have Native communities on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook that I can follow, and I can support small businesses, or just saying, hey, I'm here too. But that is the biggest experience I have with social media. And it's tough sometimes. It gets tough.
Dr. Carson.
I wanted to follow up on something that Akilah had said earlier, and it was about her grandmother being able to close the door and finding a healthy space. And I think with regards to the conversation about social media, I would like to just remind and to encourage individuals to use their own agency with regard to protecting themselves. And what I would say is, I'll use myself as an example. I had to turn off social media in the middle of all of the COVID madness because I was finding that I was not sleeping and that my blood pressure was elevating and all sorts of things. So you have to remember, you do have an off button. And I know that's very difficult to say, how do you put it down, or how do you find the space to do that? But I think it really is a reminder that we talk a lot about mental illness, but what about mental wellness? And mental wellness requires that you take care of yourself as much as possible. And so, maybe it's 4 hours a day, 6 hours a day, nothing after 5, however it is for you, whatever makes sense, try to say, I'm going to put some parameters around that. And what it also offers you is a level of control. Things seem completely out of control, but you can say, I can control this, and I can control this time. And when you're controlling that time, can you also try to think of things that are helpful or calming or positive or supportive, or do those things. And then that may help you at one of those times when you really need it.
Yeah. I mean, can I just piggyback? I 100% agree with that. And I don't know that I speak for the millennial. Scott, I'm a little bit older, Ian and Alexis. But I would say that the real issue that I think at least a lot of people in my generation have is that social media is a real addiction. I mean, we had to rely on it throughout college when we were, kids. I mean, we are the generation that had like that very hard cut between being children and then being online. And so what is difficult within that suggestion, not to say that it's impossible or something to strive for, it totally is. But I even for my job, I host a daily news podcast. So there's a level of being informed, and there's a level of like Twitter having better information than most news sources because they're getting their information from Twitter. And so it becomes a self-perpetuating issue where you have to rely on it, especially in a pandemic when you can't see your friends and they're calling you on that phone that has all your favorite apps that you love to scroll and that bright blue light that keeps you awake. It is, I think, one of the greatest challenges, and it's hard to, I think a lot of people don't take it seriously as an addiction because, they're like, well, you don't have to have a phone. Like, you have to have food to survive. So if you have an addiction issue with that, that makes sense. If you have a social life, whatever, and alcoholism is, a genetic trait. So I think that there are lots of things that you can pinpoint in other addictions that feel, like out of your control, where social media, I think, is often seen as in your control. But I think it would change people's livelihoods. It would change the way they socialize. I think it would change the way they grew up. It is a great suggestion. And it's also, like, in spite of itself, incredibly radical to say, put your phone down, throw it in the trash, and like do the thing that makes you feel good. Because most people who I think have that problem, and I'll speak for myself, I don't really like, most of what makes me feel good is unfortunately also next to those horrible racial slurs I'm going to get on Twitter.
Yeah, the fire hose is going to spew all sorts of things. We got a question by text. This one came from Danielle Ellington, who asked, what advice do you have for parents of children who are struggling? We've talked about this a little bit in terms of community support and information, gathering information. But especially if it's a parent who has not dealt with this, but they have a child who is, what would you say to that person? And Stephanie, I feel like I want to go to you first of all on this.
Well, that is such an important question to pose. So many parents come to the Steve Fund with requests for help and support, and even just ideas that can help them to navigate the situation that their child may be experiencing, or if not their child, another family member. We have resources on our website, which is www.stevefund.org. We also have organizational colleagues that have wonderful resources. And I'm going to give a shout out to Ken Duckworth and the great work that NAMI has done with the helpline, with the parent-to-parent program, with the frequently asked questions, some of which specifically address parents' needs. And I encourage young people and their families to leverage all of those resources very actively.
Thank you, Stephanie. This is Ken. NAMI has done some work on parents of young kids, and there's a program called NAMI Basics on Demand. You can do this from the comfort of your home anytime you would like. It's been shown in research studies to be effective in improving the parent's sense of efficacy and a sense of control over the vulnerabilities their children may have. And so, like the Steve Foundation, we're all in this together, right? And I feel like there's a lot of resources if people can avail themselves. I'll just say, as a child psychiatrist, the first strategy that I do is I ask kids what they know about the topic under discussion. I start with where they are. And so this is your classic meet people where they are. A 6-year-old's understanding of something may be surprisingly thoughtful, or it may be very, very simplified. And your I think obligation as a parent is to understand what they're coming from and to provide a safe conversation space for whatever the topic is, whether it's racial inequity, isolation, anxiety, fears of someone in their life dying of this virus. And I think that it's important to be able to have the conversation. And I think parents are going through a lot right now in terms of trying to attend to their kids while, if they're fortunate enough to have a job, while working online, while also becoming de facto school teachers. So I think that we've asked a lot of parents through this entire thing, and the support of our respective organizations is well placed.
Therapy can be so beneficial for so many people, and as we've talked about, it's challenging during COVID, but telehealth, there's been great advances in it. There's still a connectivity gap. There's still a lot of people out there without reliable internet access. I mean, it's can be spotty even in the best of situations. Are there things happening in the healthcare industry? And I don't know if Dr. Duckworth or Dr. Carson can speak to this.
I'll just say NAMI is fighting so that people can use flip phones to have their therapy sessions. This is crucial. There is a big internet gap in our country. Many people have access to a telephone. And one of the things in talking to dozens of therapists, some people feel more comfortable without being looked at, and they feel like they can be more open. So from Medicare to Medicaid to commercial insurance, one of the ongoing goals of NAMI's advocacy is to promote the use of non-video enabled telesessions.
I would jump in and say, you find many healthcare providers who are pushing in that direction and had started to push even before the pandemic. Probably one of the best is Kaiser, and Kaiser has been able to really take their psychiatric services online. But I would say that other people should try to match that. I think to follow along with what Ken said, and Ian had mentioned this earlier, and I even think Evan had mentioned this as well, there's great data that we are starting to have access to, specifically around trans youth and telepsychiatry. And one aspect that goes along with that is we were all saying that it would be nice to have providers who were trans or were the same ethnicity. And you're many times more able to find that on the other side of the country versus where you live. And it would be much better for you to have a telepsychiatry session, even with someone who's remote, if there's a relationship that can develop. And then the other part about telepsychiatry, and again, early days, early data, that many young trans youth feel more comfortable talking online, so that they are less intimidated being in the same room with the therapist, that they feel more comfortable. I think the distance provides them a little bit more comfort and care. And as Akilah and Alexis was saying, people are used to being online. So why not have your therapy online? So I think that this gives, for Ken and I as psychiatrists, this gives us a great opportunity in the field to make some advances with the technology that we currently have, which may be better than going to somebody's office or talking to them face to face. And I think it's really going to provide a boost as we move down that road.
Great. Let's take an online question here. This is coming to us from Damien in Southern California.
My name is Damian Henson. I am a student reporting labs journalist from San Diego, California. My question is, if you know someone who is struggling with anxiety or depression due to this whole pandemic and the effects caused by it, how can you help them?
It's a good question. How can you be a friend in the right way? Evan, what do you think?
I'll jump in. So What a Day is the daily news podcast that I host, and it is 15 minutes long. This is not a plug, I promise. I'm going somewhere with this. And it has been incredibly overwhelming for me because I'm a person who I think feels the news really deeply and personally, as contrasted by my co-host who is very journalistic. And what I have heard from so many people is that there's just too much news. And I think a lot of people's coping mechanisms, especially in a time where we're still discovering things about this virus and how long we're going to be in the house and all of this every day, it can be a negative impulse to just keep reading news, to say, I know everything about this. I know everything about this. And I think what is helpful, I have gotten pushback, so, be prepared to have someone tell you, like, I know what I'm doing. But I think that what is helpful in that situation when it's overwhelming, because it is very overwhelming, is to say, you only need to know this amount of news, like literally segment your news consumption to 2 hours a day at the end of the day. Because if things change, you don't need to be the breaking news source for your family, for your friends. We don't all have equal internet access, as has been pointed out, but we do all have, information available. And so I think that we just all have to take a step back and realize, like, we just don't know everything that there is to know about this. We're not going to find it out today. And knowing all of it, the the truth is, the things that can protect you and that can maybe, the actions you can physically take, like wearing a mask, staying distant, staying home, none of that has changed from the beginning. And so as long as we are just, realizing that the news is going to progress, and the news is a business, and business is not great in America right now, so we are going to constantly be getting it. They are going to try to sell us in every direction. You can absolutely say, you're absolutely doing your due diligence, being informed by just, taking whatever amount of time it is to get the bare minimum. This is the top line news items, and then just let it go, release it. It will be there tomorrow. That is the only way I've survived.
Yeah, well, personal boundaries, as we've talked about earlier, Dr. Carson talked about that. Evan, I want to get to you on this. What do you think in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would definitely want to also draw just a kind of distinction between anxiety driven by the news itself or the state of the world, and anxiety that's been uncovered due to the stresses, which I would consider to be two different things. in some cases. And so I think for the first, right, it's always a bit of a challenging thing, right, because there's a continuum as far as mental health issues, and there are so many different places along there that really do need clinical support, and there are a lot of places where you as a friend or you as a family member can provide sort of just peer support. But I think the first thing is creating space for the conversation and creating safety in that conversation. I think it's a little bit easier now because the world is kind of upside down for everybody to feel that you don't have to be operating at 100% efficiency right now, right? You're not expected to be hitting home runs every day because the world is nuts. And so creating that space and proactively reaching out and proactively engaging with folks, I think is a really big piece. And an important piece. But then at the same time, there's also a variety of different vectors that you can sort of add into the conversation. Things like, what the team at Crisis Text Line are doing. There's the team at Teledoc do great work. There's a number of different support resources. And that can always sometimes be a little bit of an awkward insert into a conversation. But when a conversation, is clear that it kind of needs to escalate to a professional support kind of level, it's good to first, engage and figure out if there's ways that you can help, but then also to enlist family support for that person, or if you're their family support, obviously you need to be a part of that. But if you're not a part of their core family support network, engaging those folks as need be, and then similarly giving some options about some ways that might be useful. I know for myself, when I first got out of college, therapy was kind of like a weird word for me. It was not something that I knew anybody who had really done therapy themselves. And now these days, I mean, I guess a decade and change out, it feels a lot more palatable and acceptable. And it's something that, I personally have experience with, and I know quite a few people as well who've been open enough to talk about it. So sharing experiences of your own from how you've utilized professional support is a powerful thing that can sometimes get people over the hump, if there was a hump on their side, to accessing support and care.
Dr. Carson?
I think that one of the most important aspects of the current state that we're in is recognizing that people at their core are afraid. It's fear. So And if you think about it, with the pandemic, we were very used to living in an age where infectious diseases or infections would not necessarily kill you or stop the whole world. And now all of a sudden we're back to a time where most humans have lived prior to antibiotics. And it's that we now are in a place where everybody across the world has the same ability or the same likelihood to have this infectious agent really attack them. So that is really, really makes people quite afraid. I think with regards to how do you handle it, one of the most important things that we have to do is we have to think about how everybody's different. So, some people by nature are fearful. Some people by nature are fearless. And the kinds of things that you would say to those two people are very, very different. And you have to be able to hone your message to the person. And think about your child. If you have a fearless child, you need to tell them something completely different than if you have a fearful child. And you need to be able to make that message resonate with them in a way that they can understand and understand how to control what's happening to them. And I think the last piece of advice is attached to the fear of the unknown. The world that we knew it changed. We don't know what this new world is going to look like. And all of us have to get ourselves in a place to be able to say, are we really ready to wear a mask for 3 or 4 years? The fastest vaccine that was produced in this country was the mumps vaccine. It took 4 years. So are we willing to be in the state that we're in right now until 2024? What kind of fatigue are people going to have? What kind of anxiety, depression? What is it going to do to young kids' education? What is it going to marriages and relationships? How many deaths will happen over that period of time? So it is not being negative, it's being realistic and being able to say, how do you face the world in a reality? And then how do you make sure that your underlying basic understanding of fear is managed in the response?
We're almost ready to wrap up here, but I wanted to put all of you unfairly on the spot for just a moment, and ask for a closing thought, a thing that you want people to keep in mind going forward. Just a little quote to leave them with from your perspective, from your wisdom, from your experience. And someone can volunteer to go first, and if not, I'll just start calling on people.
I'll go first.
Okay.
The wish that I have as a psychiatrist by training, always wanting to advocate for people with psychiatric disorders. The one thing that I would really wish for is that we spent as much time on wellness versus illness. So, we are moving in that direction as far as wellness medicine is concerned. But we have almost no parameters and no definitions for mental wellness. I think as we're starting to look in this future age and where we're going, we need to be able to say, these 5 things keep you mentally well. I look forward to that day, and I'm hopeful that we can find answers to that question.
Thank you, Dr. William Carson.
Well, this is Ken. I'll take this one, John. One of NAMI's core expressions is never worry alone. And if you look at the NAMI community, we are in every major city and online, and we've been working the problem of education, support, and advocacy 40 years. And I want to say the addition of the youth of our country in this conversation is so inspiring. The conversation can happen. We can talk about it. And one of the silver linings to both the pandemic and the racial injustice that's happening is I feel it's opened the windows to having these conversations flow freely among people. And it's just another opportunity to remember you should not be worrying alone.
John, I will offer a thought about stigma. And while we are seeing much more openness and conversation, so encouraging, but there are still those young people who are suffering from fears driven by stigma. And communities of color, as well as other communities, may have stronger cultural barriers that can attach. And I want to say to young people that if they are experiencing any question or experiencing any feelings of concern about their mental health, that they should take that very seriously, that they should pursue conversations with their doctors, with their family members, and with some of the other resources, such as Crisis Text Line and the NAMI resources and others that are available.
A word that Ken used was opportunity. And I hope that, you know, as painful and as isolating and kind of just generally terrifying as the world can feel right now, with all of, you know, it seems like there's just dust being kicked up from like every side of the world. I do think that we can't lose sight of the fact that this is the opportunity that we've all been waiting for to correct, you know, things that have been plaguing our society forever. It's, you know, if nothing else, this pandemic has highlighted the places that we have absolutely ignored for years. You know, since the beginning of America, which it's a pretty young country. So like, we're not too late in the game to change it. And I think that, you know, I try to find ways to be inspired by that, because I know that even on this call, there are so many smart people, so many good ideas, so much energy that, you know, I think that if we not only work together, but we like see that within ourselves. If you're watching this, if you see that within yourself, you know, take that as a good thing. You can be the leader of a time when we're coming out of this pandemic, when, you know, we are on the other side of racial inequity and we're seeing racial justice, where we're no longer discriminating against people for being trans, where we're no longer disrespecting the indigenous people whose land we live on. Like, I think that that is a beautiful opportunity. And so looking forward to that is one way to say, you know what, it's hard right now, but what did they say in The Dark Knight? The night is always darkest before the dawn. So I just try to keep that positivity while also being, you know, a member of the world.
I'll hop in here and just dive in. So I think to kind of dovetail on that, we're in a really interesting time. It feels like, not feels like, it is most certainly a time of probably the greatest change that any of us will experience in our lifetimes, and that anybody will have experienced in the past, 100 years. But in times of uncertainty and change, it's often the way that people go is to defensiveness, to conservation, to protection, to protect themselves and their families. And I think honestly, right now, the most important thing that I've seen, just in my interactions, is to give and to remember that we're all going through this together, and that we're all human beings with our own, challenges and foibles and issues that are happening, and that through the giving, I think we can actually navigate and steer the world collectively much better than individually in our own little silos. So I think that's the biggest thing for me, is just remembering that everybody's going through this together, in that we're all aiming hopefully in the same direction. For those that are not, good luck, but do the best you can. So that's my piece.
I can go. Yeah, my dog just woke up from his nap, so he makes some grumpy noises in the background. That's why. I just piggybacking off of everything that everyone's been saying. We are not alone. We have each other through this. It's hard because there's that disconnect of being through a screen, but there still are people out there that are willing to connect with us and understand us and hear out where we're coming from. Something that my partner, Jake Akita, said to me that just really resonated with me that I wanted to share on this panel was that in this age of like visibility of minorities and underprivileged groups in society, we are being talked about a lot in the news, but it's important to also talk to us too. Like, trans people don't just want to be talked about. Black people don't just want to be talked about. We want to, they want to be talked to. So it's important that we're having this conversation, that we're all sharing our experiences and resources, because at the end of the day, like, we don't just want to talk about what's happening. We want to talk through it together, and we have each other. So yeah, that's the sentiment I wanted to share.
Thanks so much, Ian. Alexis?
My turn. I think what I wanted to leave off on is, I think we all agreed on that youth today are more comfortable talking about mental health, and the conversations are, there's more of them. There's more conversation about mental health. And we want people of color and LGBTQ and all these people, that we just want representation. And like Ian said, talk to us, listen to us, have a conversation with us. And those people that are within your community, people of color, Indigenous people, LGBTQ people, if you want these changes, you can be that change. You can spark that change. Even as small as you feel you are, the circumstances, anything can come from something. And if you feel that there needs to be a change, be that change and start that change and be that voice. I promise you, if you start something, there's going to be some people that are thinking the same thing, that are feeling the same thing, that want the same change. And the best leaders always lead by example. The best leaders always lead by example. And that can be you. And there's people that want that. There just needs to be that one person that sticks their neck out. You know what I mean? But yeah, that's I think that's what I really wanted to get up there.
I tell you, whenever I'm in a place where I'm really worried about the future and what is happening with young people, I find the best remedy is to actually talk with young people, because I always come away from those conversations incredibly inspired and so thankful that we have the future in good hands. I want to thank our panel, and thank you to everyone tuning in to join us today.